A whole day spent haggling over commercial minutiae had better have been worth it, I thought, standing in the reception room of Lipitor's undersea harbor as the Canadath Manta carrying our two visitors detached itself from the docking gantry. It would be at least 3 weeks before we could get an answer, or more likely an altered proposal with more to discuss. The day after Old Ten arrived, the last day of summer, I had spent in my father's sweltering office, trying to grapple with the intricacies of great house trade. I never had a head for figures, and by the time my father called in the first advisor, the portly Attack, to help calculate profit margins and bribe percentages, I was almost asleep. Still, I would be Count of Lipitor one day, and so I kept my wavering attention on the numbers a text scribbled on scraps of parchment, struggling to stop myself looking out at the flat, inviting blue sea. This was what being a count, or any kind of ruler, was really about, and I had to admit I detested it almost as much as I hated the feeling that everybody else was looking to me for leadership. Of course, it was a good feeling when everything was going well and there weren't any hard choices, but I had experienced the worst aspects of the position during the domain invasion, and I never wanted to do so again. Although my father was improving fast, he hadn't been able to sustain Old Tun's pace for the whole day, and so by the afternoon I'd been handling Lipitor's end of the negotiations. And for my clan's sake, I couldn't give up until everyone was happy with what we'd agreed. By sunset, with the western sky tinted an abnormal reddish gold from horizon to horizon, I knew that winter was here, and pleaded clan duties for a chance to swim one last time in a sea, and pleaded clan duties. Who did you plead with? What you mean to say is you pled to put your clan duties aside for a little bit so you could enjoy the last bit of summer. But the sentence structure, like in both of these books, sentence structure is so wonky. For a chance to swim one last time in a sea still warm from the day's heat. It wasn't the action of a clan leader, and I felt I was letting my father down, but who knew when I'd have the chance again? There wasn't time to go very far from the city, or I'd have to come back in the dark. So I went a little way along the shoreline to the beach below where we'd been sitting. As I slipped out of my tunic in the strange, eerie light, the forest behind me almost silent, I looked out to sea. The sun was a burning orange ball against that astonishing coppery sky, bathing the city and the shoreline in a ghostly, almost apocalyptic light. My own shadow was a grotesque dissension, like some gaunt wraith against the line of trees and the golden sand. But strangest of all was to see, amid the colors of this spectacular sunset, the rippled surface of the ocean was stained a deep blood red. "The wine-dark sea," I said, not realizing I'd spoken aloud until someone answered. "I was thinking the same thing," Ravana said, standing up from where she'd been sitting in the shadow of a rock. We studiously avoided looking at anything except each other's faces. The Thetan poet Ethios had lived nearly 600 years ago, but he must have seen a sunset like this one on some ancient island before mankind had even set foot on the shores of Oceanus. "I've never seen it like this before," I said, gesturing out at the panorama of sky and sea. Nor have I. Ravana walked down the beach to stand nearby, another tall shadow form. Not even at the beginning of winter, when there are always wonderful sunsets. It's strange, really, how all these colors that the domain likes so much can seem so beautiful. They tarnish everything they touch, so why not the sunsets as well? The sunsets have been here a lot longer than the domain, and they'll be here a long time after it's been forgotten. I envy the people who'll watch something like this one day and never even have heard of Heresy or Inquisitors. We'll never be able to do that, I said, but I promise this, as far as I can. One day we'll watch a sunset like this from this palace of the sea in Sanction, like the old hierarchs used to. She caught her breath and stared at me for a moment, then shook her head in puzzlement. There were so many things you nearly said just then. In fact, there were, and some of them I didn't even realize until much later. It sounded a strange thing to promise, but both of us knew what it meant. Sanction, Aquasilva's ancient sacred city, had vanished when the domain rose to power. Neither of us would be able to enter it until the domain were gone, if the story of its disappearance was true. 200 years without sound or sight of it was the clearest indicator that the account was correct. But there was more, and if I'd known what was to come, I'd never have said it. Ravana was wiser than me, and had already grasped things that I was too blind to see, and what neither of us mentioned, not then at any rate, was what the ritual of watching the sunset had meant to the hierarchs personally. "Shall we swim?" Ravana said. "Shouldn't that be asked?" After a few moments' silence. We did, enjoying the warmth of the dark water until the ball of the sun finally disappeared and only a purplish afterglow was left in the western sky, with indigo-clouded silhouettes against it. We didn't refer to the moment again as we pulled tunics over still wet bodies and went back to the palace. The next morning an impenetrable layer of low cloud covered the mountain tops, and there was a bitter chill in the air. Winter was like that now, although it hadn't always been. There was an absolute cut-off between winter and summer, a boundary we passed at the end of each year. After that date, the first storm system that blew up would last for months, a third of each year, give or take a few weeks. Only the domain, with their ability to control and see the weather from above, knew why this was, and of course it wasn't in their interest to tell anyone. I watched from the undersea harbor reception room for a few moments as the Canadarth Manta glided off into the gloom with slight, leisurely beats of its huge wings. Only when the water had completely swallowed it up did I turn and dismiss the two marines who'd serve as an escort. I had work to do in the palace, but there really wasn't any need for them now. One good thing about winter, I reflected as I climbed the stairs to my study in the palace, was that the hours spent inside weren't as bad. There was nothing to do outside except when it was snowing, and that novelty soon wore off as the cold seeped through my clothes. I wasn't an Ocean by birth, and I was never really happy in the cold, as much as I wanted to be. A year in the archipelago, where it never snowed, had been enough to convince me that I didn't really miss it very much. My father had given me the study years ago, and I'd used it on and off since then. In the last few weeks, though, it had begun to feel like my tortoiseshell. One of the servants had already lit the fire, and the room was pleasantly warm and welcoming, more than could be said for the documents on the desk. I sat down in the chair and picked up the top sheet, my interest sparking when I saw Palatine's wild handwriting on it. For a moment I was puzzled, then I remembered what it would be. I'd mentioned to her during a break in negotiations yesterday that we'd need to pick her brains about Theta. She evidently taken the idea to heart, because there were 2 pages entitled Business in Theta. The first point, underlined several times for emphasis, was Theta is ruled by the Emperor. Following that was an equally emphatic Thetans hate Tanathans. Some of her words needed the services of a code breaker to decipher them, but I guessed at the ones I couldn't immediately identify. After I'd finished, I leaned back in the chair and stared at the paper for a moment, wondering whether a proposal had been such a good idea after all. There had been no other logical place to sell the weapons on to the Kalarthari. Yeah, I hate this word. Every time I look at it, I'm like, damn you, Q! I hate you! Dissonance. Theta was central, neutral, and as in that, let's try this. Taneth. You could buy or sell absolutely anything there. On the other hand, Palatine had pointed out several glaring disadvantages. The Thetan clans made life as difficult as possible for Tanathans trying to trade. A lot of them were very inward-looking, protectionist, and given to wasting their strength on infighting. At the other end of the spectrum, clans like Palatine's own were fierce fighters and imperialists, despite their belief in republicanism. As for Celerin Alistray, the fabled Thetan capital, gods above, some of the things she'd written had to be exaggerated, for whatever reason. I mean, surely no one could be a clan president and go to parties 3 nights out of every 4? And as for the orgies she mentioned, it read more like the Book of Ranthas's description of the evil city of Malara, supposedly destroyed by the wrath of the gods hundreds of years ago. I had to ask her about this directly. I tugged on the bell pull, and a few minutes later, one of my younger cousins, who was on running duty, appeared at the door. Could you find Palatine and ask her to come as soon as it's convenient? He nodded and disappeared again. I would have preferred to find her myself. It seemed somehow rude to send a messenger, but I knew that if I went to find her, it would be hours before I got back to work again. Palatine came up half an hour or so later, as I considered a request for extra clan funds from the town of Gesredden. The clan 10th there wanted to put in a new water system because the old pipes were falling apart. From the sound of it, the Farasan contractors who'd installed them in the first place had done a shoddy job. No point in hiring the same lot. I'd have to find out which group had done it. Elements. This was tedious. Elements? Is that supposed to be a swear? Cathin. I looked up, sighing with relief, and shoved Gesredden's petition to one side. It could wait. Nobody was going to be putting in a new water system in winter. I hope I haven't dragged you away from anything important. You're probably doing something much more vital than I am. You wanted to talk about Theta, she said, coming around to my side of the desk. She didn't look chilled, so she hadn't been outside. Almost certainly she'd come now because she was bored, and I didn't blame her. I read your report, but some of it is a little hard to believe. Unfortunately, it's all true. She dragged up a chair from the corner, and I pushed mine away from the table to give more room, kicking it savagely in the process. You can't be serious. Even the president of Decarius and his brothel? Cathin, as far as all this is concerned, you're still a naive provincial. Theta is a wreck, and when things go as wrong as they have there, people start acting very strangely. But if all this, I took her report from the pile, is true, then how come the Thetan Empire is still so powerful? She didn't answer for a moment, staring thoughtfully off into the distance. There are two sides to Theta. Yes, there are the things I wrote that worry you. The clans don't care about anything much except prestige and the good life. Not all of them, of course. She added meaning to her own clan, the warrior Kentanai. All of this is what you see in Theta, in the big cities and Celerin, Ulstray. I hate these names. I can never say them. But you forget that the Thetans are the best sailors in the world. We're both Thetans, you and I, and neither of us is happy away from the sea. For you, the sea is even more than that, but everyone knows that. When it comes to ships, Thetans are the best. And that, despite assertions to the contrary by Tanathan merchant captains and Cambrasian admirals, was certainly true. The rest of the world viewed the ocean as a highway and a route for trade, as well as vast natural fish farm, but it seemed that, for Thetans, it was something more. Not a god or goddess, or, as the semi-mythical exiles believed, a vast living organism, but more than just a place to travel through and harvest food from, and the Thetans had founded the Fuck words! I suck today! Oceanographic Guild. Why is that so hard to say? I don't know. So you're saying that it's their fleet that keeps them powerful, that and the Emperor. The one subject she'd avoided so far, there'd been no mention of him in the report, which had intrigued me. How could you write about doing business in Theta without mentioning the man who, in name at least, held more authority than anyone else on Aqua Silva? Even the Cambrasians were afraid to cross the Emperor openly, though they wanted more than anything else to be free of even the illusion of Thetan overlordship. You've left him until last. She nodded. He's more dangerous than all the rest put together. What's he like, as a person, I mean? He's probably the most brilliant emperor we've ever had. You feel, when you talk to him, that he's always several steps ahead of you. Of course, he plays chess, and he never loses, but he's heartless, cold, ruthless, anything in that line you can think of. He's not a good ruler for Theta, because he wants to be absolute monarch, and we won't let him. I thought that was the point of an emperor, not our emperor, Palatine said with a touch of pride. In Theta, the emperor, or the empress, and we've had a few of them, isn't like, say, the Helotite king of kings. He can't order someone executed without a trial, or issue edicts when he feels like it. In fact, she paused, fists clenched as if she was concentrating on something just out of reach. He's not really an emperor at all. He leads the fleet and the clan assembly, but they actually pass the laws. He's just the balance. Without him, the clans would fight all the time. With him, we just fight some of the time. Orisius wants more than that. He wants to rule on his own, and he wants the old empire back. But because most of the clans are so disorganized, he can't get anywhere, and so he turns to the domain for help. Okay, I do want to say I like the name Orisius, not only because I can say it upon reading it, but it kind of sounds cool, which is clearly a butchering of Osiris, but who the hell cares? Which was the worst problem? A megalomaniac on the Thetan throne wasn't too much trouble, given the Empire's weakened state. But if he was hand in glove with the domain, because I'm too much of an asshole to use hand in hand, that's too beneath me, was a different matter. My father told me he was under the Exarch's thumb, and said something about an illness. Exarchs were the domain's protenants, owing obedience only to the four primes, and in some cases not even to them. The ex-arch of the archipelago invariably a nasty piece of work, had ruled his vast spiritual territories as a secular empire ever since the Archipelagian Crusade left a power vacuum there. The Exarch of Theta, although less powerful, still wielded an immense influence equal to that of the king of my own continent of Oceanus. That's sort of true, she said. He was very ill when he was 13, and it changed him. Sometimes he gets headaches which make him pass out, and you don't see him for days. So he has migraines? You should count yourself lucky you aren't in his place, because you'd have exactly the same problem. That was something I didn't want her to remind me of. Both of us shared, wait, you did? Since when? Okay. Both of us shared Osiris's bloodline. Palatine was his first cousin, and I was probably the same, although I wasn't certain yet. And though I never have admitted it, the thought terrified me. If either the Emperor or the Domain ever found out, I'd be tied to the stake again before I could blink. And this time there would be no merchant lords on hand to help. Osiris Osiris. I'm putting an R in the wrong place. Orosius, I think is how you actually say it. Whatever. Who cares? Who gives a shit? Orosius had already tried to kill Palatine, and as a woman she was much less of a threat in the Domain's eyes. And as for the illness, I can remember that, because I'd been ill at exactly the same time. But how much under the Exarch's influence is he? Depends. She sat back in the chair, pulling a fold of her heavy winter tunic straight. When he's ill, the Exarch's virtually in charge, and the rest of the time Osiris relies on him as first advisor. There's a man called Zarathek, too, who's in charge of the Secret Service. Those two and Tetanus are the only people he trusts. We were nowhere near the original subject, doing business in Theta, but I didn't mind. Tetanus had promised to reveal my identity when he returned, and it was as much to be sure of that as for information that I delayed our departure. With any luck, the Domain was unaware of the existence of another of Osiris's cousins. What puzzled me was how anyone could have lost track of me originally. I knew I'd been born a Tar Conator, one of the imperial clan in Theta, and that for some reason when the Chancellor of the Empire had abducted me when I'd been a few hours old. And that for some reason. Okay. There had been nothing about a hunt, so presumably the whole incident had been somehow hushed up or written off. But why go to all the trouble in the first place? If we sell the weapons in Celerian Aliste, is the Empire going to find out? I asked abruptly, changing the subject. For some reason I didn't feel like talking about the Emperor anymore. Celerian Aliste's a very cosmopolitan city, Palatine said. Not as many people as Tanith, but on a bigger island. Very hard to track down who's doing what, so unless they're looking for us, Tanithan merchants selling weapons in the Thetan capital, it's not as if we'll be noticeable. She ignored the sarcasm. A gust of wind rattled the window slightly. I looked outside to see the previously unbroken gray cloud now scudding westward out to sea. It had taken on a darker overtone, almost purple, a storm then. Ranthus only knew how long this one would last. I think you'll have to sign an agreement with the Thetan clan. Not one of the ambitious ones like mine, but a small one, not that many commercial interests, and probably on the fringe. Better with the major clan, but they all hate Tanathans too much. It's the only thing they agree about. Is that a normal thing to do? I scribbled a few words on the bottom of her report to remind myself. It's been known to happen. Anyone you can recommend it? Anyone you can recommend? I can give you some ideas, she said, shivering, but Canadrath will be more useful. Things must have changed since I left, and why is it so cold in here? With an exaggerated sigh, I got up and went over to the heater valve. In winter and during storms, the palace was heated by hot water piped around the edge of each room. There was a flame-wood furnace in the cellar that did the heating. It was expensive to maintain, but necessary, given the icy temperatures in midwinter. What would it be like, I thought, opening the valve some more and going back to my seat, to live somewhere warmer? The archipelago and Theta didn't have winters like this. Elements only knew why. Why is this a thing now? The elements thing. Oh, it was colder, and there was very little sun, but in the archipelago this was the monsoon season, when it rained every day, sometimes for weeks at a time. As far as I was concerned, that was infinitely preferable to freezing temperatures and building-sized snowdrifts. You come and live in Theta for a while, and you'll see what a civilized climate's like, Palatine said. Getting drowned in my rain, you mean? I leapt to the defense of Lipitor despite my personal feelings. This was home, and where I felt the cold more keenly because of my Thetan blood. It was used to the climate. I thought you liked being wet. There's a slight difference between swimming in the sea and swimming down the street, I said. Palatine grinned. You'd love it. I'm sure you're part seal. No one else has this thing about the ocean. And there you were, telling me about how all Thetans have a bond with the sea. If you're not careful, you'll end up sounding like a Tanathan. I prefer Tanath, she said, suddenly serious again. I could tell because she started fiddling with the stylus, running it up and down the edge of the desk. Tanath is growing. It's going somewhere. You can tell that just by listening to Oltan talking. Canadarth is a big house with secure trade routes and lots of money. They could be sitting on their backsides, letting the money flow in and concentrating on getting on to the Council of 10. But instead, because they've had the sense to see a problem early on, they're planning to launch a risky new venture, and with House Barca, who they hardly know. If this was Theta, they wouldn't be doing that. They'd be knifing their rivals in the back, not bothering to go out and try anything new. Theta's living off past glories, and nobody seems to care. Palatine twisted the stylus viciously, and it flipped out of her fingers to fly across the room, hitting the heavy winter curtains. There was a guilty look on her face as she got up to retrieve it. But why? She'd only spoken about Theta a few times, and I'd never really understood what had begun the decline. You don't pay enough attention to anything that's not science. She was right there, I had to admit. I'd been given a noble's upbringing, schooled and tutored thoroughly by my father, who believed in as much education as possible, but I'd only ever worked at anything scientific. History, theology, law, grammar, all those subjects bored me intensely, especially theology. And as for the writings of the Thetan philosophers, for a time I hated Theta simply for producing so many of them. Every country has its day, Palatine went on. 200 years ago, Theta won the Netter War, and had a chance to develop, but then the domain came along, and the hierarch murdered his cousins and became emperor, and it all fell to pieces. And you've seen how the domain rewrote history to make us the villains of the war. But why did you let them? I know you weren't there, of course, but why? Who knows?" She gestured expressively with the stylus. "It happened, and the clans gradually surrendered everything to Tanith. 200 years ago, Tanith didn't even exist." That, at least, I had remembered, along with fragments of other continents' histories. Tanith had been founded by refugees fleeing the devastation of the war, who'd seen the islands on the divide of the shattered Equatorian continent as a safe place to settle, protected by a few miles of water from the internet's struggles on the mainland. What one man has done, another can undo. Now you quote Thetan poets at me, and I always thought you hated them. I don't understand 9 out of 10 things they say, but I can use them here and there. You never get by in Theta. They argue about poetry in the assembly. All the clan leaders have read everything. I remember watching a session once, when my father was still alive. The president of Mandagor and the president of Nalasel fought on the floor of the assembly about whether Severian was sympathetic to war in his epics. Palatine smiled faintly. Trivial, really. It shows you how far we've sunk. But at least we still have something left, our poetry and our music. We can even argue about philosophy sometimes. But the domain closed all the academies, didn't they? There's something you have to understand about Theta if you're going to get involved with Ravana. I say Theta, but it's the same for Kalathar and the rest of the islands. You didn't see it so much when you were there, because we were off the beaten track. In Theta, people live outdoors. Our cities are built around plazas. Our houses and palaces are built around courtyards and gardens. Even the emperor holds court outside a lot of the time. And even when we're indoors, there are as many large open spaces as possible. What it means is that we talk. We spend hours in cafes, parks, colonnades, spending time with groups of friends. We don't sit inside in ones and twos and scheme. Nothing ever stays secret, and there is no way to stop ideas from circulating. The domain closed down the academies, banned demonstrations as heretical, and introduced a religious police to make sure heresy wasn't being discussed. But in spite of all that, they failed. You cannot stop people talking in the archipelago, any more than you can stop the sun from rising. That's really why they hate Kalathar and all archipelagians. They can't control us like they do everyone else. But the Tanithans, too, spend all their time outdoors, I protested. Palatine shook her head. Not in the same way. They base everything around their houses, and all the important people only go outside in order to go from one building to another. In Theta, everything important is done outdoors, and you can't be a clan president if people can't see you. You can't hide, and that is why the domain and the archipelago cannot coexist forever. Sooner or later, however long it takes, one of them will destroy the other. Chapter 3. We waited for 2 more weeks, and still Tanis didn't come. The skies over Lipitor remained unrelentingly gray and bleak, broken only by a 5-day winter storm that came from the south. A freak cyclone cutting across 3 storm bands, it inflicted serious damage on the town of Gasraden and Courtiers land farther down the coast. 18 days after Olton left, the Burkham Manta making the bi-monthly iron run arrived in Lipitor with a sealed message from Hamilcar. Thankfully, my father had resumed most of his responsibilities, I thought as I took the letter upstairs. I was still taking care of more clan business than I had before, but it was only out of a sense of duty. "Come in," my father said when I knocked. He was sitting behind the desk, as I had seen him so many times before, and looked almost the same. There were lines around his eyes that would never go away, though, and I felt a momentary stab of hatred for the dead Prime, who tried to seize Lipitor from us. I hoped she was floating in the void beyond, cut off forever from the gods she'd pretended to worship. I handed him the letter, wrapped in a waterproof cloth bag, with weights sewn into it. He raised his eyebrows expressively. There are things here he definitely doesn't want anyone to see. He stood up and went over to the blue globe. Well, no shit. If it's in a sealed envelope, duh. A lovingly crafted model of Aqua Silva in miniature that stood on its pedestal in the corner. A tiny aether generator in the base swathed the model of our world in continuously changing cloud patterns. My father gave the mounting a very slight twist and withdrew a thin sliver of metal from the globe's north pole. Dangerous for him to stick his neck out in writing. You don't look closely enough, my father said, as he returned to the desk. Look at the seal on the bag. It's got a domain impression on it and a Prime's mark. Almost certainly a gift from his guardian. His guardian, who just happened to be Belshazzar. I thought, irritated, that I hadn't spotted the tiny, leaping flame symbol. I guess you just glanced at it instead of actually looking at it. 'Cause, something important. Yeah, I just glanced at it. Forget about it the next minute. Hamilcar had already proved his loyalty during the invasion of Lipitor, but Ravana still didn't trust him entirely because of his link with Belshazzar. He was a Tenth merchant, after all, and there were some things it was safer for him not to know about. The metal silver had a tiny irregular serrations in it, a particular pattern that would open the seal on this package and nothing else. Hamilcar had given it to us before he left, in case he ever needed to send confidential messages. I hadn't expected it to be used so soon. Well, it would have been nice to see this instead of being told this, but okay. The bag was actually made of a fine metal mesh that was covered in oiled cloth and secured at the neck by a cylindrical lock, with 4 keyholes to further confuse matters. It must have cost a fortune because the workmanship was exquisite. Only kings, exarch, and merchant lords could afford this kind of security, and no money could have bought the primarchal insignia on the seal. My father slipped the key into the lock, turned it, and then pushed it in a little more, before opening the bag and taking out the letter written on several pages of expensive parchment. There was a silence while we both read it, though, a silence broken only by shouts from the garden below, where some of my cousins and their friends were taking advantage of a day of patchy sunlight. Advantage, not adventure. Advantage of a day of patchy sunlight. What do you think? My father asked when I finished the last page and looked up. He isn't taking any chances, assurances from the dissidents that they're interested, confirmation that they can pay, third-party communication. Even the letter doesn't mention anyone specifically. My father nodded. He's a lot more cautious than House Canadrith, but given his position, I'm not surprised. They can afford a lot of new ventures. He can't. But he's looking to expand business in the archipelago once he gets going, and diversify to other fields than weapons. At a guess, I'd say he's not confident about Tanith's chances of survival. I hadn't got any of that, and he must have seen my chagrin. Don't worry, I've been reading political letters for 30 years. You have to read dozens before you can recognize a lie, or something that isn't being said, and even then you'll still miss them sometimes. He wants us to make contact with the heretic leaders in Kalathar. I said, hoping that I hadn't missed anything else. Through Ravana, but he says nothing about Palatine or Theta. She was a clan president's daughter. I'd have thought he'd want to use her contacts. I couldn't for the life of me see where that had come from, but even when I reread the passage I failed to see what my father was pointing out. Hamilcar did want us, through Ravana, to contact the leaders of the heretic dissidence movement in Kalathar, principally to see whether they had enough money to do business with, I thought. I'd have to ask Palatine and Ravana if they'll come, I said. Of course you must. Kalathar is dangerous, though. For the three of you to go there now, after what happened here, would be tempting fate. The domain keeps a close eye on arrivals and departures. What about arranging another meeting point, somewhere neutral like Ral Tamar, I suggested. It would take longer to set up, but be better for everyone. It sounds a good idea, but I think you'd have problems. It'll be easier for you to get into Kalathar than for some to get out. We could have asked Sagantha, but in the meantime, wait, you could have asked? But you can't now, even though you just found out the news. But in the meantime, Ravana should be able to help. You're in her hands here. It's her country and her people who'll suffer if things go wrong. At that moment, the Aether communicator on my father's desk buzzed into glowing life. Who is it? He asked, sounding annoyed. The Ocean Geographic Guild, 'cause I can't say that word now, apparently. It was Tetricus, an oceanographer I'd known as long as I could remember. I could hear his excited tone, even though the slight distortion of the communicator. My Lord Count. Shouldn't it just be my Lord or Count? Anyway. I'm sorry to disturb you, but we've just found a recording of a kraken on one of the ocean probes. The master said you might want to see. He couldn't get through to Cathan, but if you could tell him, he's here, and we'll be down right away. He cut the link. I'd already jumped to my feet, hardly believing what Tetricus had reported. A kraken this close to land, it was unheard of, and the chance to see one. My father smiled faintly as he stowed Hamilcar's message away in his desk and picked up his cloak. The recording would be there any time, of course, but kraken sightings were so rare, even in the deep ocean, that many people never saw one. My father had once before, but I hadn't. Well, duh, that's what you've been telling us, so big whoop-de-doo, you're just restating what you just already told us. Anyway. We couldn't find my mother, Ravana, or Palatine, but my father left a message with the guards telling them to come down to the oceanographer's building as soon as they appeared. For all that, the sun was shining. It was a blustery day, and the wind kept tugging at the hems of our cloaks. There seemed to be a rain of dead leaves coming down from the roof gardens that hadn't yet been sealed in for the winter. Gusts of wind whirled them around like miniature ocean currents. There were people in the streets, although the market stalls that stayed up for the rest of the year had been dismantled and the town seemed empty without them. People waved to us as we passed them, and I endured a 5-minute wait as a marine captain at one of the gatehouses conferred with my father about relaxing the guards so that more marines could be sent to help ravaged garrison. Elnabal seemed to have an almost superhuman patience for delays, and though I concealed my impatience as best I could, he could see it well enough. Word obviously hadn't gone around yet because there wasn't a crowd of people on the steps of the oceanographic building. Sometimes I can say the words, sometimes I can't. Built in the same style as the rest of Lipitor, it had a turquoise tile dome rather than a roof garden, and a large equipment yard around it. Underneath, I knew there were bays for the guild's official sea ray and my personal one, Walrus, clever, which they'd given to me rather than mothballing it when it got too old. I was rarely around these days, so the guild was making use of it when they needed a second ship. Once we were inside the building, it was easy to know where to go. A babble of voices was coming from the imaging room on the left side, and we found the entire guild staff squeezed into a small room, their eyes fixed on a blurred aether screen about 2 cubits square mounted on the wall, above a mountain of recording and enhancing equipment. "This is too much to believe," one of the master's assistants was saying. "Run it through the filter again," said the master, sitting in one of the 2 chairs. "Too much blue still. Can't make out any details." "What if we change the contrast as well?" someone else suggested, their face hidden behind an apprentice's craning head. The master nodded, his walrus mustache twitching up and down. "Good idea. Come on, can't be here all day." Tetricus, standing at the back, moved aside to make room for us, then looked around. "Here's the Count and the S-Count," he said, and attention was momentarily diverted from the screen. "Don't worry about us," my father said, "we can see." It wasn't strictly true, being so short. I couldn't see the screen because of Tetricus's head in the way, but he made enough room for me to slip in and get a clear view. "That's better," the master rapped. "Stop here." "Without a doubt," the assistant said gleefully, a look of amazement on her normally sad face. Sad? There was an almost tangible air of excitement in the room, not at all spoiled by the general lack of space. "Look at those fins." My eyes were riveted on the screen as I watched a patch of ocean suddenly get darker as something appeared through the gloom. It was still indistinct, but I could make out the movement of a pair of flippers. Surely they couldn't be that big, though. Then it began to turn side on, and I gasped, "Sweet Thetis." Sweet Thetis? Really? It was huge. It's the biggest dong of a fish I've ever seen. I thought Palosaurus were big, but this? The neck had to be 10 yards long if it was an inch, and those jaws could have swallowed a shark. I watched in stunned silence as a vast, pitted body passed in front of the recorder, dominating the field of view even though it was 700 yards away. The body was entirely black because at the distance and depth the recorder could only pick up shapes and movements, but that didn't matter to me. It was the most awe-inspiring creature I'd ever seen. No wonder the domain regarded Kraken as the spawn of chaos. Beside a creature like this, Belshazzar and the whole domain paled into insignificance. "Look at that skin," Tetricus said. "Must be 6 inches thick. Have you got a length measurement yet?" the master asked somebody else I couldn't see who was crouched down in the corner beside one of the machines. "It's got to be 70 yards at least." "How on earth does it feed itself?" the assistant said. "It must need to eat about a whale's weight every day." "I think they eat anything," said the animal expert. I didn't care who that really was, or I'm about to give his name in the next part. Ferrates, launching into a detailed account of strainers and shrimp. His exposition faded into silence when the tail came into view. "Maybe a bit longer," the master said, banging his fist on the table. 80, I make it. Better go and check on previous sightings." With a few more flicks of its sinuous, elongated tail, the monster disappeared into the gloom again, and someone froze the recording. "Holy Ranthus!" "Yes, I'm sure." Tetricus said. How on earth can anything be that big? What's it doing up here? More to the point, the master asked, rhetorically. There we go. Sometimes I can say words. I speak English good, yes. I wonder why it didn't attack, Heresy mused, frowning. That probe's more than a yard across. The beast must have noticed it. It probably can't see very well, the master said, and maybe it's like a dolphin, uses those strange clicks. It seemed bizarre, comparing the titan that had just swum across our streams to a dolphin. But then, not as bizarre as the idea that something so big could exist at all. We watched the recording again, this time to the accompaniment of a spirited argument between Ferretates and the assistant about why the creature might have come up to the surface from its lightless home. What's the deepest any ship's ever gone? Tetricus asked, as the master delegated the two apprentices to set up another screen in the colonnaded front porch of all the people who'd be along once the news got out. 9 miles, I think. Ferrets, whatever, said, breaking off from his argument for a second. 13, I said at the same time. When was that? Ferris demanded. If you're thinking of the Revelation, the deepest they recorded was 9 miles. We don't know how far they got on the last expedition, though, Tetricus pointed out. It could have been much deeper, even if we don't have the record. But I don't remember anyone claiming to have got as far as 13. During the Tonator War, the Thetan flagship went to 13, I said. It was a calculated risk telling them about that, but it was a matter only of interest to oceanographers. And besides, they might be able to help. I don't remember reading about that, Ferret said belligerently. Tetricus shrugged, but looked intrigued. I didn't have time to say anything else, because at that moment the master's cane jabbed me in the ribs. I swung around to see a fierce expression on my face. Why didn't you write up your last check in the logbook? He demanded. Water temperature's down 2 marks at the ledge of the bay, and you didn't tell me? Come into my office and give me a verbal report. You may be the S-count, but while you're a member of my guild, I'm not having that sort of sloppiness. I bridled. There was no need for him to berate me over something like that, but I caught an almost impenetrable jerk of his head. I was smarting as I followed him into the office, and he closed the door, cutting off the noise from the lobby. Sorry about that, the master said gruffly, sitting down the small cluttered desk in one corner. There were 9 oceanographers in Lipitor, a big staff for somewhere this size, and the building wasn't big enough to accommodate them all properly. You were about to say something you would regret. What do you mean? I perched on the edge of the chair that was occupied by the Ocean Geographic Station's cat, Flipperless. That's a shit name for a cat, but I understand why you thought it was clever. Most stations had one for luck, but Flipperless was, like most cats in Lipitor, half wildcat, and fairly savage if disturbed, so I was careful. It's not a good idea to mention that ship, he said, especially not where people can listen. Are you talking about the Aeon? What else? He demanded. Thetan flagship in the war. Of course I'm talking about the Aeon. But anyone with any sense keeps their mouth shut about that ship. Do you know where it is, then? Don't be stupid. I know it exists. And so do some of the other masters. If we knew where it was, we wouldn't have this discussion. But for everyone's sake, the domain are better off not knowing. What I want to know is, why are you looking for it? The storms, I said. The Aeon had access to the sky ice system. It could see the weather from above. If we could predict the storms, it would take away a lot of the domain's advantage. The master's face hardened. So you can do to other cities what you did here? I don't like the sound of that. If you think I would, then you obviously don't know me very well. Why bother then? He demanded. Command of the weather can only help you if you prove the domain can't protect people against it. And the only way to do that is to unleash a storm on some city that happens to have an Inquisitor in it. You'd rather I left the Inquisitors to their work? After what they did here? You're not even denying what I'm saying, Catherine. Here in Lipitor you saved all of us from that mad Prime and her schemes, using the storms the way you did, to protect your clan, your girl, your friends. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you use the Aeon to work with the storms somewhere else, you're the one in the offensive, and you will cause people's deaths. So, instead of just predicting weather, he can cause it? How? That doesn't make any rational sense. I'm going to use the ship to predict storms. So we can have a better idea of, warning people and things. That would be better than just whenever the domain says, it's winter or summer or whatever. But no, you can't do that because you'll create storms. How did we get from we'll use it to see clouds and stuff so that we can warn people about storms and things approaching to help them out, to being dickbags to them? I don't see your leap in logic. He wasn't going to see it my way, which saddened me. I hoped the guild could be some help, but the master was about as typical a senior oceanographer as you'd find. If the domain didn't behave the way they did, I wouldn't need to use the storms at all. That's the way of the world, Catherine. There's only one God, and they are his followers. They're dangerous at the moment, yes, but that's no reason to risk your life to forsake the true religion. Your father doesn't believe, but he was always content to fight his corner. Well, that makes sense why I inserted into that, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Missing a word. You're not your father's son, though, so I shouldn't be surprised. Whether that's his biological son or not, that's his dad, and you deserved a punch in the face, 'cause you're an asshole. I stared at him for a moment. I'd known the master since I was 7, and though he'd always been rough and strict, he'd never been anything but fair. Now he seemed to have turned against me suddenly, become someone other than the master I knew. I felt as if he'd just stabbed me. So if you won't tell me about the Aeon, who will? Nobody. As far as the guild is concerned, the ship is lost for good, and no oceanographer except me will tell you otherwise. The planet doesn't like being interfered with, Catherine, and you've already done it once. I don't know how, but okay. His weathered face creased into a smile, but to me it just seemed like a mockery. You'd make a brilliant oceanographer. It's a pity, really. Bitter, I stood up and stroked the sleeping cat one last time. I doubted I'd see it again. My real father is dead, Master Domitius, but I'm sure he was no worse than the Count. Catherine, the master barked, as I left the room as quickly as possible. What do you? The door closed and cut off the sound of his voice, and I brushed my hand savagely across my eyes. There were still a lot of people in the lobby, but thankfully my father seemed to have gone, and Palatine and Ravana were nowhere to be seen. I collected my cloak and almost ran out into the street, heading away from the palace. I felt terribly hurt as I walked blindly along toward the new quarter, unable to believe what the master had said to me. Why had he been so hostile? Was it the ship, or the whole idea of heresy? But as I went along, the feeling of rejection was gradually replaced by cold rage. If the oceanographers weren't going to help me, if all they could see was their own small corner of the world, then I didn't need them. Maybe in Qualathar, where the Inquisitors were torturing people every day, they would be more willing to help. And if not, then I would find and use the Aeon with Palatine Ravana and my Archipelagian friends. I didn't want to unleash the full force of a storm on anyone, but after what the Domain had tried to do to me and the others, I couldn't let such considerations get in the way. It wasn't until the evening that I had a chance to talk to Ravana and Palatine about what my father and I discussed earlier. Rather than use my study, which was too big to be comfortably warm, I lit a fire in the cramped storeroom I'd converted into a sitting room. The tapestries on the walls made it uncomfortably hot in summer, but in winter they kept the chill out very effectively. Where were you earlier? Palatine said, throwing herself down in the chair opposite the fire. When we got to the oceanographer's place, no one knew where you'd gone, and the master was looking for you. He can look all he likes, I said, sitting beside Ravana on the cushioned bench seat. Then I changed the subject. We had a letter from Hamilcar this morning. He agrees with House Kenrith, but he's not going to commit himself until he's sure the dissidents can pay their way. You mean he wants to go to Qualathar? Palatine said immediately. I nodded. How thoughtful, Ravana said acidly. I get the chance to go home again and help him in the process. Very convenient. Just Qualathar? Palatine asked, her expression alight at the prospect of doing something at last. Not Theta too? He's got his own contracts in Theta, Ravana said. It's safe to work there, but he can't be seen getting involved with Qualathar. His guardian might get upset. That's unfair. You wouldn't sign a business agreement with an organization you knew nothing about, and besides, Ravana, you are their leader by descent. How many people in my home country have ever seen me? If I go in there and tell them I'm the pharaoh, first they'll lock me up while they check, and then they'll keep me locked up so I don't get in the way again. That's if the Domain don't find out, and offer me the use of their prisons instead. Bigger rats, but warmer. She wasn't smiling. I discovered in the last 6 weeks just how tenuous Ravana's claim to the throne of Qualathar was. It derived mostly from the assumption that the rest of her family, who she hadn't seen in 13 years, were all dead, and even if that was so, she would only be the second pharaoh of her dynasty. Her grandfather, Othura, who had died in the Archipelagian Crusade, had taken the throne after a 50-year interim, with no prior claim at all. Perhaps more worryingly, if somebody chose to challenge it, it was the fact that no one alive seemed to be able to prove her kinship to Othura. On the other hand, as far as the Quatharans were concerned, the pharaoh was female, approximately Ravana's age, so perhaps they knew something she didn't, and the Domain seemed to have been very thorough in butchering her family. You have to go back sometime, Palatine said softly. They believe in you, and they can't sustain that belief forever. The longer you wait, the more they'll build you up in their minds, and if they make you into a messiah, it'll cause as much trouble as it solves. It might be enough to drive the Domain out, though, I said. The archipelagos suffered enough. You're possibly right, Palatine said musingly. I think the Domain can only push so far. If they go over the edge, they may find themselves with another uprising. And the last one in the Archipelagian Crusade, Ravana cut in. If you've quite finished planning my country's future, you haven't yet convinced me that we have any safe way to go to Qualathar. Nothing's ever safe, you should know that. But we know enough heretics in the archipelago to have an introduction. How many people know who you are? About 6, Ravana said. Who? Does it matter? Yes, most certainly. Sagatha is one, of course, and who else? My 2 guardians before him, who lived in World's End, and Ilithis, my father's sister in Tihama, President Alice, oh my god, the words, Ali Durisi, and Fernando Baratti. I don't recognize either name, but evidently Palatine did. President. If I remembered rightly, was the Thetan Archimelagian equivalent of Count, only presidents were usually elective rather than hereditary. Ali Dirisi might be a problem, because he's still in Calathar pretending to be a devout and faithful clan leader. Fernando Baratti, how does he know? He's just a playboy, spends his whole time chasing girls, like the Emperor does. His elder brother got me out of the Domain's clutches when I was a baby, and Fernando paid for one of my changes of wardship. You'll have to explain sometime how Clan Baratti got involved, but if Ali Dry sees the only one we have to deal with, it should be possible to pass you off as a dissident living in exile, with the right connections. It took another half-hour of argument before Ravana was persuaded to see Palatine's point of view. I helped when I could, but mostly let Palatine do the talking. Explaining the whole thing as one of her convoluted and usually successful plans. The trouble was, this time it had to be successful. During the invasion of Lipitor, her plan had only been salvaged by Halmakar's intervention, and in Calathar there would be no such safeguards. Palatine looked very pleased when we finally got up to go to bed. Almost certainly because we were finally doing something, as you keep stating. I had wanted to wait a little longer, but we were going to leave for Oceanus' capital, Farasa, in 2 days' time. In the coastal trader Parasur from Farasa, we could catch a ship to Ral Tumar, the biggest archipelagian city outside Calathar, and from there on to Calathar itself. But I had no more time to wait for Tanis. I didn't want to find out just how closely related to the Emperor I was, because somewhere deep down I already knew the answer, and I was more frightened of that truth than I had been 6 weeks ago of being burned at the stake. That night I had one of the terrible nightmares that had plagued me as a child, and that not even the healer had ever managed to wake me from. Most of it was too terrifying to remember, but when I woke up, Osiris's cold, insane laughter was still echoing through my head. Well, my feelings on this book are pretty much the same as the last book. Could not give a shit less about what's going on. I don't care about economy crap. If I did, I would be working in the stock market or have stocks. It's not interesting to me. You couldn't make this interesting to me by talking about it non-stop. I don't really see it. The book has an easy flow to it if you like this kind of thing. If you like economy books, you'll easily get into it, I think. But if you're like me and could not care less about how businesses and stuff works, then pass. There's no reason to read this unless you like the reading of Heresy. And that's all I really have to say about this. It's the same thing as Heresy, Just different stuff is happening. Instead of iron, we have the discovery of Kraken. Oh my god, we have Kraken. And that's really about it. We have some allies. Shahardan's a bad guy. And a lot of stuff happened in the last book that really doesn't make me want to go and read it. And apparently a lot of stuff happens in this book that really doesn't make me want to read it. So I'm not reading it. But again, if you like, if business is your thing, if economy is your thing, pick up these books. It is the Aqua Silva trilogy. You will like it because this is about doing business and using, it's not, I prefer more action and let's get our swords and go kill things. As opposed to, let's corrupt shit with money. And let's get around these problems with money. That is not interesting to me. I want to be the person with a giant hammer or axe and smashing dudes. More like that, less business. I'm Caleb, and this has been Red Knot. Thank you for listening. Bye!